On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy was, by most honest measures, the most formidable naval force in the Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers, the finest naval aviators on Earth, battleships and cruisers built around a doctrine of decisive fleet action that Japanese admirals had been rehearsing since their victory over Russia in 1905. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, that Navy had swept from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean without losing a major fleet engagement. Singapore fell, the Philippines fell, a Royal Navy squadron sent to stop the advance was sunk in an afternoon. American planners at the time were not debating whether Japan could be beaten. They were debating whether it could be beaten before 1946. The men flying off those Japanese carrier decks were, in early 1941, arguably the best trained naval aviators on the planet. Candidates for Japanese carrier pilot programs were selected from thousands of applicants and put through years of instruction before ever seeing a cockpit in combat, producing a small, elite corps capable of extraordinary precision. It was this force, not raw numbers, that had let Japan run the table across the Pacific in the war's opening months. What almost nobody in that cockpit realized in 1941 was that the entire system built to produce them had no real capacity to replace them. Japan had built an navy around an irreplaceable aristocracy of pilots and an economy that had no intention of ever needing to replace an aristocracy at scale. It took less than 4 years to prove Tokyo's planners wrong about the timeline, and the machinery that did it wasn't a single weapon or a single battle. It was 4 separate American advantages, arriving in overlapping waves, each one enough on its own to cripple a navy, and together enough to erase one entirely. The first crack appeared 6 months into the war in a windowless basement beneath Pearl Harbor. A Navy cryptanalyst named Joseph Rochefort and a small team of officers had spent years chipping away at JN-25, the Imperial Navy's primary operational code. Without official backing and with a reputation among some of his superiors as a crank chasing an unsolvable puzzle. By May 1942, Rochefort's team was reading a working majority of Japanese naval traffic, enough to tell Admiral Chester Nimitz that a massive fleet was steaming toward a target Tokyo was calling AF. Rochefort suspected AF was Midway Atoll. To prove it, his team had the base cable a fake message about a broken freshwater plant in the clear and waited. Within 2 days, Japanese radio traffic referenced AF's water shortage. Nimitz now knew where his enemy was going, when, and roughly how many ships were coming. What followed on June 4th, 1942 was not a fair fight. American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese fleet carriers on their flight decks mid-rearmament, packed with fueled aircraft and armed bombs, and turned them into infernos within 6 minutes. A 4th carrier died by nightfall. Japan lost 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, along with hundreds of irreplaceable veteran aircrew for the cost of a single American carrier. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had built his entire war plan on knocking America out before its industrial base could turn the tide. 6 months in, an intelligence failure had already cost him the initiative he needed to win before that base woke up. Midway broke the back of Japan's carrier fleet, but the second crack, opening at almost the same time in the waters and jungle around Guadalcanal, broke something arguably more valuable: the pilots. Japan had no equivalent of the American rotation system that pulled experienced aviators out of combat to train the next generation. Japanese pilots flew until they were killed, and over Guadalcanal and the surrounding Solomon Islands through 1942 and into 1943, hundreds of them were. Squadron after squadron of the veteran aircrews who had opened the war over Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean went down over a stretch of jungle few of them had heard of a year earlier, and the replacement pilots arriving to take their place had a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors carried. The elite corps Japan had spent a decade building was being spent in months, with no functioning program to build another one behind it. The third crack opened slower than the first 2, and almost nobody noticed it happening at the time. In December 1941, the United States Navy declared unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan, and for nearly 2 years it barely mattered. American torpedoes ran deep, failed to detonate, or exploded prematurely, a defect the Navy's Ordnance Bureau spent an embarrassingly long time refusing to admit existed. Submarine captains who lined up perfect shots and watched their torpedoes thud harmlessly into a hull without exploding filed reports insisting something was wrong with the weapon itself, only to be told repeatedly that the fault was theirs. It took until late 1943, nearly 2 full years into the Pacific War, for the Mark 14 torpedo's problems to be properly diagnosed and fixed. Once they were, American submarines, never more than roughly 2% of the Navy's total manpower, went to work on something Japan had never adequately protected: the merchant fleet that carried its war machines oil, rubber, rice, and troops between the home islands and everywhere the war was being fought. The results, once the torpedoes actually worked, were catastrophic for Japan and almost entirely invisible to the American public following the war through newspaper maps of island landings. By the war's end, American submarines alone had sunk well over half of all Japanese shipping tonnage lost in the Pacific, more than 54% of it, cutting a nation of home islands off from the resources its factories, farms, and armies depended on. Japan's merchant marine, which had carried over 6 million tons of cargo capacity at the war's start, was reduced to roughly a few 100,000 tons, still capable of putting to sea by August 1945, a collapse of nearly 90%. Tankers carrying oil from the captured fields of the Dutch East Indies back to Japan were hunted almost to extinction, and by 1944, the Imperial Navy's own capital ships were beginning to run short of the fuel needed to conduct major operations at all. Aircraft carriers make for better documentaries, and codebreaking makes for a better story. Submarines strangled an empire quietly, one tanker at a time, and paid for it in blood. Of roughly 16,000 American submariners who went to sea in the Pacific, close to a quarter never came home, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American armed forces in the war. The fourth and final crack was the one Japan had no answer for whatsoever, because it wasn't tactical. It was arithmetic. The Imperial Navy entered the war with 6 fleet carriers and the industrial capacity to build a handful more over the following years. The United States, in the same span, laid down and commissioned 24 Essex-class fleet carriers alone, ships that went from keel to combat deployment in under 2 years, built by a shipbuilding industry that treated a 30,000-ton aircraft carrier the way Detroit treated an automobile production line. Add in light carriers, escort carriers built on merchant hulls, and the new construction never stopped arriving. Japan lost a carrier at Midway or the Coral Sea and mourned an irreplaceable asset. America lost one and had a replacement steaming out of Newport News before the loss was even confirmed in the newspapers. That mismatch produced the single most lopsided air battle of the entire war. On June 19, 1944, in the Philippine Sea, Japan launched what remained of its rebuilt carrier air arm against the American fleet covering the invasion of Saipan, roughly 400 aircraft flown by pilots who, after 2 years of catastrophic attrition, had nowhere near the training hours their predecessors had carried into Midway. American fighter pilots, flying newer aircraft with better radar direction and vastly more flight hours, logged before ever seeing combat, shot them out of the sky in numbers that gave the battle its nickname among the aviators who fought it, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost somewhere near 600 aircraft over 2 days. The United States lost roughly a tenth of that, most of them not to enemy fire, but to fuel exhaustion during a night recovery that Admiral Mark Mitcher, in defiance of blackout doctrine, ordered lit up so his exhausted pilots could find their way home. Japanese naval aviation, as an institution capable of contesting the sky, effectively ceased to exist that afternoon. The pilots lost were not going to be replaced with anything close to their equal, because the training pipeline that had produced them no longer had the fuel, the aircraft, or the time to try. By October 1944, at Lake Gulf, the largest naval battle in history by a wide margin, what remained of the Imperial Navy threw itself at the American invasion of the Philippines in a plan so desperate it required decoy carriers with almost no aircraft aboard to serve as bait, luring the bulk of the American fast carrier fleet away from the invasion beaches, so a separate Japanese battleship force could slip through unguarded and destroy the landing itself. The decoy worked. Off a stretch of ocean near the island of Samar, a Japanese force built around the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, emerged from a channel expecting to find nothing but empty invasion transports, and instead found a scratch force of small escort carriers and a handful of destroyers, the only thing standing between that fleet and the entire American beachhead. Outgunned by a margin that should have made the outcome a formality, those destroyers charged the Japanese battle line anyway, laying smoke and firing torpedoes at ships many times their size, while the escort carriers' aircraft attacked with whatever ordnance they had, including dummy runs by planes that had already emptied their bomb bays. It very nearly worked for Japan anyway, for the better part of an hour, before the Japanese commander, uncertain what he was actually facing and running low on the tactical patience the moment required, turned his battleships around and withdrew. When the battle ended, days later, Japan had lost the last of its fleet carriers, several of its battleships, including one lost to American submarines before the surface battle even began, and any remaining capacity to contest the ocean in a conventional naval engagement. What followed for the rest of the war wasn't naval strategy in any traditional sense. It was kamikaze attacks, a doctrine born at Lake Gulf and built entirely around the admission that Japan no longer had the aircraft, the fuel, or the trained pilots to win an air battle in the conventional sense, only enough left to trade a plane and a life for a single hit on an American hull. None of the four cracks alone would have broken the Imperial Japanese Navy on the timeline it actually collapsed on. The codebreakers bought the war's first real turning point, winning a battle in June 1942 that nobody outside a Pearl Harbor basement thought was winnable yet. The attrition around Guadalcanal quietly bled out the irreplaceable veteran aircrews Japan had spent a decade training and never found a way to replace. The submarines starved an empire that had never planned for its supply lines to be the target, cutting off the oil and raw materials an island nation with almost no domestic resources of its own needed simply to keep functioning. And the shipyards, in the end, simply built faster than a country with a fraction of America's steel, oil, and industrial labor pool ever could hope to match, replacing every carrier, every pilot, every hull that went down at a rate Japan had no theoretical path to matching, even with a perfect navy and perfect tactics. Put together, these four advantages turned a navy that had run undefeated for 6 uninterrupted months into a navy that, by the summer of 1945, had nothing left to sortie with, no fuel remaining to burn if it did, and no pilots left alive with anywhere near the flight hours needed to fly whatever aircraft still sat, often camouflaged and hidden on its remaining airfields. Japan had planned for a short war, betting everything on winning it in a handful of decisive fleet battles before American industry could fully wake up. America answered by building a machine that didn't need a decisive battle at all, one that could simply keep producing ships, aircraft, and trained pilots faster than the war could destroy them, until there was nothing left on the other side of the ocean capable of putting up a fight.